Anyway, all right. I want to welcome everybody to the April 5th edition of Noisy Reality. My name is Jim Dingman. We're very pleased today to talk with Rockford Weitz. Rockford Weitz is a professor of practice and he's the director of the Fletcher Maritime Studies Program at Tufts University. We're going to be talking to him on the current crisis in the Middle East, but uh, unlike some academics we've talked to, Rockford has also been a commodities trader. He set up a company called CargoMetrics. So he has a lot of practical experience. Plus, he has academic experience. He got his law degree at Harvard and his PhD at Tufts. And he directs the Center for the Study of Maritime Studies,
That's
Rockford?
right. Maritime studies, correct.
And the Arctic Circle, which is I hadn't thought about asking about that one, but anyways,
Yeah.
it's great to have you. Now, first of all, let's get your take on what is going on right now in this conflict.
All right. Well, I think we're entering the critical period, in all honesty. I think that so what's happening here actually really relates to the oil supply chain. So crude oil, you can't really use it. It has to be refined. And there are refineries in the Gulf. And that's part of the fact that they can't get their gas. So when you refine crude oil, you produce gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, other things. They're called refined petroleum products. But many of those refineries are in Japan, South Korea, China. There's many in the United States and other parts of the Americas. The oil that left the Strait of Hormuz and was on its way to Europe or to America or to Japan, and when that was all stopped shortly after February 28th, it takes a long time going at only 12 nautical miles per hour all the way there. So they haven't even reached Rotterdam yet. But that's all going to change in the next couple weeks. So those refineries that have to keep going to be at maximum efficiency, they have to find some oil to replace what would normally have been going through the Strait of Hormuz for now over 35 days. And so, as bad as it has been for gasoline prices so far, and really the U.S. is much more sheltered than Europe and Asia. It's been much worse there. It's about to get much worse. Now, what that's going to do is it's also starting to increase crude oil prices in the United States because the United States, of course, is an alternative for those refineries. So we're in this critical period from a markets perspective, and then of course we're in the critical period in the war, right? So Trump had said at first it was going to be 4 to 6 weeks. He gave himself a 2 to 3 week extension a week ago. So I think in the next couple weeks we're going to see what happens here, and either they come to a deal. That's one possibility. They come to a ceasefire. So, sort of major bombing happens and then the U.S. essentially just kind of stops. But without a deal. Uh, or, and this I probably is, I think, a low probability. There could be some kind of regime change in Iran. It's not impossible that would happen. And then that would change all kinds of things. But we're in a period of tremendous uncertainty in the war, and we're in a part where the markets are going to start really having real pain, and that pain will result in higher prices for average people. It's already happened in Asia, especially kind of the near market. So India kind of got hit first. India and Pakistan, they had to cut a deal with the Iranians. They're going through the sort of Iranian northern route that goes by Rock Island, which essentially they've negotiated that directly with the Iranians. But they needed to.
Ayatollah booth.
The Ayatollah booth, as Saul Mergagliano says. I agree with that. It's a good dad joke. And then there are some passing over Oman. I don't know this for a fact. I live in the unclassified world, but I think we might have some Marines there in northern Oman or some army kind of with sort of missile defense capability over those ships. That's my hunch. I haven't confirmed that. It wouldn't be confirmed yet. But we'll see what happens. I mean, I think this is kind of like the lead up to the real game time here.
All right, let's get into specifics about the
Sure,
oil.
let's do it.
So when this conflict began on the 28th, just give a sense of how important the exports are from the Gulf in terms of the economies of the rest of the world and how much has to flow in. Because you're talking about 12 knots. What does that mean in practical terms, in numerical terms, as
Mhm.
percentages of different vulnerabilities of these countries around the world to this shock?
Yeah. Okay, great. So let me put this. So the Strait of Hormuz is critical for a few major commodities that are of really strategic importance. Number one, crude oil. Number two, liquefied natural gas. And then there's some others, refined petroleum products and helium that would be in the next basket. So kind of key chemicals. Helium is important for semiconductor manufacturing, for example. Um, Most of that goes to Asia. And that's a relatively new development, I would say, over the last little less than 20 years with the shale gas revolution in the United States. The United States has gone from being an oil importer to an oil net exporter. We still import oil, but we also export. It's complicated, but net, we're an exporter. That was not the case until that happened in about 2000, 2007, 2008. So we're going to get hit last. Now with gas, so liquefied natural gas, we're a major exporter, as is Qatar. Our gas prices have remained stable, even gone down a little bit. So they're less than $3 for a trillion cubic meters, whereas in Europe, they're $30, 10
30.
times the
Wow.
price. I mean, it's really a big difference. And then in Asia, they're even more, right? And so really the way to think about it is Asia's getting hit the worst, and I would say the Indo-Pacific, including the Indian subcontinent, right? So the Indo-Pacific's getting hit first, then Europe, and last us. And where we're feeling it the most is in crude oil, because even though we are essentially self-sufficient in oil, because oil is a globally traded commodity, you can't really insulate yourself unless you were to do some pretty severe export restrictions, which would actually be very counterproductive, to be honest. Like it actually harm the economy quite a bit. And so the reality is that a supply disruption anywhere in global oil causes a price increase everywhere. It's not equal. Asia gets hit the worst, the Indo-Pacific gets hit the worst, then Europe and Africa, actually, we should say the global south also gets hit a lot. So Southeast Asia, Africa, to a lesser extent, the Americas, it's not just the United States, but the Americas are pretty, we get hit last, in part because the United States produces so much, but so does Canada, so does Venezuela, so does Colombia. So even Brazil is an oil exporter. So there's a lot of crude oil and natural gas in the Americas. So we're going to get hit last. But as Asian prices go way up, it's just too tempting for oil traders to just trade their stuff and send it to Asia, which then raises the price in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Now, explain a little bit how you understand this issue of the fertilizer.
Yeah, so when you refine crude oil, one of the byproducts are these components to fertilizers, things like nitrogen and sulfur and urea. So these are things that, as you take the crude oil and remove lots of things, you remove sulfur, right? You remove all these different components that then can be used in fertilizer. And what the Gulf countries have done, so whether it's Saudi Arabia, UAE, or Kuwait, they've decided instead of sending that to be just refined in Singapore and Japan and Europe and the United States, they do a lot of refining locally. And therefore, they export those fertilizer components in addition to exporting crude oil and liquefied natural gas out of the Strait of Hormuz. But as we've seen, really since March 1st, it dropped off pretty quickly after combat operations started on February 28th. We've seen those just really plummet from over 100 ships a day to now single digits most
Right.
days. They've gone up a bit to maybe 10 or 11 a day, but you're not even close to over 100. So we're still in a very supply constraint. Well, I'll make one last point, which is inside the Gulf, they depend on food imports as
Right,
well and all the manufactured goods that
right.
go in on container ships. So, in addition to the export blockage, there's also an import blockage, which shouldn't be forgotten.
Yeah, that's a good question. I wanted to get into that. What's the flow of food into the different Gulf states and Iran? I mean, Iran, of course, is a huge country. It
Yeah,
probably is to some extent agriculturally self-sufficient.
correct.
What is going on in terms of the flow of food and other products into the Gulf that has been disrupted? What's your assessment of that?
Yeah, so Iran decided actually to try to become self-sufficient from an agriculture perspective. This was maybe 10 or 15 years ago. That has actually triggered a water shortage in their country because agriculture is normally like the biggest water user. So for California, our biggest agriculture state, 80% of the water in California is consumed by agriculture. Agriculture is very water intensive. And so you do have some agriculture in the Gulf states, which is really desalinated water, very expensive, being used for sort of high-end agriculture. So things like fresh tomatoes will be in greenhouses, but that's not, it's hard to feed millions with that, right? In fact, you couldn't do it. What they're lacking are the imports of your basic grains and so wheat and rice and things that are brought in at scale into the Gulf, usually just to Dubai, and then from Dubai they're shipped from there within the Gulf to Kuwait and Bahrain and Qatar by smaller ships. But so what you have is they have storage, so it's not a crisis yet. If the flows open up, I would say by the end of April, they'll be okay. What they're missing so far are things like fresh fruits and vegetables, right? It's hard to find bananas and fresh fruits, but again, there's still enough rice they can make the breads, and they have a lot of storage in Dubai in particular, and so they're able to weather the storm. And then, of course, we've seen a big, huge increase in food imports from the Red Sea side of Saudi Arabia, and they're literally trucking the food across Saudi Arabia to the Persian Gulf side. So you do have food in all cases, except for really there aren't significant gas pipelines that connect Qatar by land to other places. But crude oil, the Saudis have really scaled up their cross Saudi Arabia pipeline. They're trying to get it to 7 million barrels a day, which the Strait of Hormuz is normally carrying 20 million barrels a day by tanker. So having seven go across the pipe by pipeline to the Red Sea and then out from the Red Sea, it can go either direction as long as the Houthis stay out of the fight.
Right.
Fingers crossed. But it certainly could go to Europe in any case through the Suez Canal. But could probably go to Asia as long as so far the Houthis are kind of quietly collecting tolls. They did launch some missiles to Israel, but they haven't attacked commercial shipping. My theory is that they're getting enough sort of revenue from the shipping side quietly, like it's not official, but enough that they're kind of living the good life there, and they're not going to disrupt that unless they think it makes strategic sense for them, which I don't think it does. So there's also a pipeline that goes across from one part of the UAE to another, so from their Persian Gulf coast or Arabian Gulf
Right.
coast
To
to the Arabian
Fajara.
Sea, and it can handle about a 1.5, maybe 2 million barrels if they're really pushing it. So that's good. That can handle roughly a little less than half of what's normally going out with crude oil. And then the food can, it won't be a crisis. You're not the Gulf states are too wealthy to have widespread like famine or something like that. But it's still going to be more expensive, so they're going to face inflation. And then there's going to be certain things that just aren't available because they're not economical enough to truck across the Saudi desert. And fresh fruit would be probably, one of those that they'll just have to wait until things stabilize to get that again in places like Dubai.
So, how do you understand the issue of when sanctions were lifted with Russia and with Iran in terms of the oil? Is it simply the fact that there's this push and impact on, for example, Asia, and that you have this other? I'm personally thinking that the whole problem is that Trump knows that politically, if he allows the price of barrel to go to a certain amount and it stays there for a while, it'll be even worse of an impact on the world and also on whatever kind of machinations he wants to do in terms of, quote, affordability within
Correct.
terms.
Yeah.
But just give a sense of how you understand that whole aspect of what's happened with the Russians and
Yeah.
Iranian oil.
Yeah, so I think that's what it is. So I think it really is that I think what has happened here, and we'll know more kind of after the war. Things I think information will come out, but I think they underestimated how long this is going to take. I don't think that's too
Yeah, that's
controversial of a
you're right,
statement, right?
exactly.
And that therefore they wanted to. So the thing that Trump really cares about, of course I think really is the gasoline and diesel prices in the United States. And the reason those are so powerful politically is Americans drive by huge signs. Number one, most Americans buy some gas or diesel, if not every week, certainly every month, right? And so they notice the price increases, but they also drive by them every day, probably. And so they're politically very, very powerful. And what are called temporary easing of those sanctions against Russia and Iran was meant to do was to suppress those by letting essentially the world trade in those, including U.S. allies like Japan and Philippines that really need the oil. And then they're not going to have to pull that oil from the United States, which would then raise the prices here in the United States. So I think it was probably just Trump trying to keep the prices down
Right,
while he thought about, can I wrap this thing up
right.
either with a negotiated settlement or with just a ceasefire after they've sort of done enough destruction that they feel like there's the marginal benefit is. So they kind of check the box saying, there's not much else we can hit. We're going to pull back. I think we're not going to leave the region because I think we are going to try to help assist securing the Strait of Hormuz, but they could declare victory. And I mean, this would be so Trump style. Declare victory, even though it's not really a victory, but it doesn't matter. To him, it doesn't matter. Like he's going to declare victory no matter what. And other American presidents have done this, so it's not like it's some ways American tradition. But basically, declare victory and call it good, and then essentially really dramatically lower the bombing in Iran. And then the question is, and this is what nobody knows, I certainly don't know, what does Iran do in that scenario of the ceasefire? So no deal, essentially a unilateral ceasefire by the U.S., unclear what Israel does, right? Probably they stop at Trump's request at first, but unclear how long that lasts. And then the question becomes, does Iran attack Gulf allies for kind of tacitly supporting the war and therefore complicate things? And does it keep constraining the Strait of Hormuz, or does it let things go? And I think it's really hard to know because in some ways, the way for them to rebuild after a ceasefire is to get their oil flowing.
Mm.
And the best way to do that would be, and maybe they would collect some tolls, right? So, and they would say, why don't you guys come pay us $2 million? We're going to use that to rebuild our. And so I could see them being tempted by essentially the financial incentives to open the strait. And there'd be some, what I find in the Gulf, and I've lived in Abu Dhabi for 6 weeks, and I know the region relatively well. What I find there, and I've studied it for 30 years, what is said in public and what is said behind closed doors are often totally different. And so, there could be a backroom deal, quiet deal between Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, and whatever new government sort of emerges in Iran might be what it looks like today. Kind of, it's unclear exactly who's in charge, but whoever's in charge, Mohammed bin Salman, MBS in Saudi Arabia is going to find out who to call, and they essentially say, you rebuild, we'll rebuild. Let's try to keep, hopefully Trump can declare victory and kind of sail away. I think we all benefit from that. And the Iranian regime might say, we'll take it, right? And it might be, so the unilateral ceasefire may end up becoming kind of just a lowering of the temperature. On the other hand, they might say, because of just the culture there, sort of the honor shame culture where we've been dishonored, and we're going to save our honor by at least for a couple weeks, continuing to attack the Gulf countries for having those American bases there and essentially tacitly supporting this war. So I can see that also as a scenario that's plausible. Um, in in the former case, if there is essentially a ceasefire or a cessation of hostilities, it's still going to take time for this all to get through the markets because it takes time for those tankers to get to their destination. So I think we're going to be feeling this, certainly I would say through the end of May. But then in the summer, if things go well, we might start to see things kind of get back to normal.
All right. Well, we don't know what's going to happen,
We
actually.
have no idea.
I
Absolutely
mean,
agree.
admittedly, uh, he could just declare victory and pick up his marbles and go home. Um, and hopefully that'll happen because I don't see how it would benefit him to continue on this road. Because for those of us who are familiar with past escalations of American military power, it's sort of it reminds you of 1964, 65. But anyway, so
Absolutely.
let's get into the question of the Straits of Hormuz, because you're an international lawyer. Um, what's the laws about that? I mean, because the
Yeah,
size of the Straits of Hormuz is huge. It's
absolutely.
if when you impose New York City on it, I saw today. I was looking for the maps the New York Times did today. They had this map which basically saw the from the tip there
Mhm.
of Oman up to Bandar Abbas. It's sort of from Staten Island all the way up to the Hudson to Tarrytown. It's a big, huge
Absolutely.
open area, and it's
Yep.
vast. So where does Iran get off on saying that they control it, and how's that work in international law?
Yeah. Well, this is pretty clear under international law. Iran is a party to the UN Convention on Law of the Sea. U.S. has signed it. We haven't ratified it. That's a whole nother topic for another show we could do. But we do recognize it as international law, and the Gulf Cooperation Council countries have signed and ratified it. The European consumers, the Asian consumers. It's the law that would be governing what can pass through the Strait of Hormuz. And under that's actually, so this is actually I teach a whole class on this. There's a specific article that covers, specifically, they're called Straits Used for International Navigation. It's Article 34. And that would be, so historically, has not really been contested by Iran. Sometimes they kind of say, oh, we should be collecting tolls. Really, tolls are really meant for canals. So the Suez Canal charges tolls. The Panama Canal charges tolls, but those are national canals that were built or are in the national jurisdiction of those countries. Totally different from a strait. Strait of Gibraltar is a great example of an international strait. You know, the UK through Gibraltar, a piece of territory, and Spain and Morocco, they're not collecting tolls. You go through there, and as long as you're complying with sort of the parameters that are outlined in the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, you're following the traffic separation scheme, for example. You're not dumping pollutants in the water. Things like the coastal states have some rights to govern what you do as you transit a strait used for international navigation, but they can't stop it unless you're a belligerent. Now, so the what the Iranians are arguing is they're going back to the UN Charter and under Article 51 saying we're under attack and therefore the people attacking us, the U.S. and Israel, can't send their ships through this strait because they're at war with us. And one of the big questions is who else do they consider belligerent? Do they consider the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, so Saudi Arabia, and the small Gulf states, UAE and others, Bahrain? Do they consider them belligerents? It's unclear, right? But let's just talk about what should be happening. What should be happening is if you're not in the fight, you should be able to transit through the Strait of Hormuz unimpeded, not attacked, not hit by drones, not hit by anti-ship missiles. But that's not what we've seen. So what we saw, I mean, I think it's because, so I always tell my students, with international law, you can't really separate the politics from the international law. You can try some international law, you can. So the most effective international law that never really changes due to politics is the most boring. So, for example, what I use in maritime is there's conventions through the International Maritime Organization, which is a UN body focused on shipping, that say life jackets should be orange, never contested. It's just like accepted. Even in times of war, they're still using the orange life vests. Okay, so basically, the more boring and technical the international law is, the less contested it is. Obviously, a strait used for international navigation, as important as the Strait of Hormuz is, carrying all those goods we were talking about earlier, it's going to be, uh, it's going to be influenced by the politics, right? And so, what has happened there is that the commercial shipping, so commercial ships are governed by the flag they fly. Most of them fly what are called flags of convenience, or by the industry open registries. These are kind of tax preferred flags. Panama, Liberia, Marshall Islands are some of the more famous ones. This isn't really Panama's fight, right? So a Panamanian flag would say, hey, like, I'm a Panamanian tanker, let me through. I'm just carrying some oil from Kuwait to Japan. Like, I'm not in this fight. You shouldn't attack me. But, and I think it's related to the politics, because Iran was essentially decapitated pretty heavily at the beginning. And I think they went into crisis mode, and they decentralized their mosaic strategy, right? And I think they just, I've heard a number of different analogies to it, but I think the best one I've heard was actually Kareem Sanjapur, who's at the Carnegie Endowment. He said it's like an octopus that had its head cut off, and it had 8 arms flopping around, and it hit all 6 of the Gulf Cooperation Council states, and it also hit Israel and the United States. But it's like not being strategic. It's like lost its brain. So it also attacked tankers. It attacked a tanker that was flagged by Thailand. I mean, Thailand's definitely not in this fight, right? And so I think that what happened, therefore, was that even though your legal right to go through exists under international law, hasn't really been contested by the Iranians, at least officially, right? But it's still risky to go through. And ship owners, even though they have been able to reinsure, at first the insurance markets actually broke, which happens when there's a huge amount of uncertainty. So for the first few days, you literally couldn't get insurance for your ship as a ship owner. And ship owners aren't going to really go without insurance, because many of them are bank financed. And the banker says, you can't sail without insurance with this $100 million plus thing that I loaned you money for, right? That makes a lot of sense. And the bankers have a lot of influence, of course. And so the ship owners waited until the marine insurance markets reestablished themselves, which they did. They're expensive, but you can get insurance. And that insurance cost is passed on to the consumer, by the way. So the ship owner will do it if it makes sense. But just like, you may have insurance for your house, but you're not going to engage in risky behavior to have your house burned down, because going through the insurance process is a real pain in the neck, right? And so even though you're covered with like a ultimate loss, I won't lose my shirt, but you're also gonna, if your ship is damaged, you're not going to be making money with your ship. And so there's a reason, though, that even though the marine insurance markets reestablished themselves just a few days after they went offline in early March, most ships have waited. And there have been a few sort of brave Greek ship owners. I call them the tip of the spear, kind of back to Greek history. They made the run. They switched off their transponders, just kind of then reappeared in the Indian Ocean. They made a lot of money doing that. But they're risk takers. But there aren't that many risk takers. And then a few of the countries like India and Pakistan negotiated with the Iranians to go through that northern corridor.
Right.
But we're just starting to see this weekend, the last, say, 4 days, we've seen some ships start to go through Omani waters. It's unclear what the arrangements are. It was a French, I think, container ship went through. Unclear if that was like a deal cut by the French, or they just decided to go through Omani waters, assuming that the Iranians wouldn't attack them if they were in Omani territorial waters. So we're still in the fog of war from a commercial shipping perspective as well. And I think the next 2 weeks are going to tell us a lot.
Now tell us a little bit, you did your dissertation on insurance, on maritime insurance, and explain how that works in a situation like this.
Yeah, so think of it, it's actually very similar to car insurance. This is what I found to be the best way to explain it to folks. So um, the ship owners essentially all are insured going through these what are called risk areas. And it's the technical term is they need a war risk coverage. They pay extra to go through an area that's risky. So when the Houthis were attacking commercial shipping in the Red Sea became a risk area. You had to pay a premium to have your ship covered by going through there. Right now, the Strait of Hormuz, of course, is a risk area. It's considered, so you have to pay extra to go through and be covered. Now, if everybody pays in, which really they do because their bankers require them to do so, then what it does, it actually creates a functional insurance market. It's very similar to automobile insurance. If everyone pays in, and say 100 ships go through, but one gets attacked by, say, a drone or gets damaged with a torpedo, who knows, whatever it is. If you're collecting a lot of premiums as an insurer for, say, 100 ships, but you lose one or two or even 10, the market survives because essentially everybody is paying into the system. And then, when there's a catastrophic loss for that ship owner, they get repaid. So that's the way it works. So what happened was because this was such a sort of, it was surprising on February 28th when all this happened. Insurance markets really kind of were in shock. And they just said, we don't know how to price this. So we're not offering it. And so that really did stop the traffic very abruptly. And so then, and if you think about it, once you stop a system, then to start doing it again, of course the industry is going to be a little tepid, right? They're going to approach it with caution. Nobody wants to lose a ship. Nobody wants their crew to be harmed, right? And so, but we're going to see if what's starting to happen with, say, 10 transits per day, way down from 100, but if 10 go fine and then 20 go fine, you could see that really actually increase very quickly over a couple weeks, assuming that the situation's relatively stable and nobody, there aren't incidences. But this gives the Iranians actually a lot of power over the situation. What we say in my classes, this is asymmetric warfare. So when Trump says, I sunk their whole Navy, blah, 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 that's their conventional Navy.
Mm.
The unconventional Navy, they're essentially they're kind of maritime militia.
Right.
And they're going to use drones. They're going to use, cruise missiles. They're going to use mines deployed by fishing boats. These are things that are going to be hard to combat, but very disruptive and could cause the shipping to stop just because of just because they don't want to take the risk and they'd rather wait it out and let others take the risk. And so this is what makes this such a complicated situation. And one of the things that my research team and I at the Fletcher School are looking at is, to me, this connecting what has happened in the Black Sea with the Ukrainians who have no navy, essentially bottling up the Russian Black Sea fleet with maritime drones and anti-ship missiles in a congested waterway. That was example number one. And then we had the Houthis, also like just a non-state armed group, first non-state armed group to fire an anti-ship ballistic missile, by the way. That disrupted shipping also in a constrained waterway, the Red Sea. I think what we're seeing is a pattern, which is the new naval warfare. It's not going to be what we saw in World War II, carrier battles in the middle of the Pacific or the Indian Ocean. That's not going to happen. It's going to be in these contested waterways, countries like Iran, who have a geographic advantage, mountainous terrain on the entire northern coast of the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. They can fight a asymmetric war very similar to how the Viet Cong did on land in Vietnam, right? So the U.S. had superior firepower in Vietnam, but asymmetric warfare using geography against us, using the jungles against us, right? In the end, we don't win that war, right? Nixon declares victory, right? But it wasn't really a victory, right? And so I think we're seeing something very similar unfold in the waters, especially congested waterways. So, like I said, Black Sea, Red Sea, and then now, sort of Strait of Hormuz. That's three case studies that show you that drone warfare is here. And one of the things that I think is important to consider, so mines, which are very simple, have caused more damage to the U.S. Navy than any other weapon system since World War II. So in the last since 1945, the U.S. Navy has lost more vessels to mines than anything else. And where was that? Oh, the Gulf, Strait of Hormuz during the tanker war, during the Iran-Iraq War. So the Iranians have been practicing for this, and really like an underwater drone, which the Ukraine or semi-submersible drone, which the Ukrainians have really perfected. That's basically a smart mine. People don't think that way, but I think in the future, people will think that way. That's just my take on it.
Interesting. Um, Many years ago, I interviewed the captain of the Vincennes,
Oh,
who
wow.
was, I think U.S. Naval Institute Press did a book about his experiences, as you know, in '88 when they shot down that airliner.
Yes.
And Ernest Will, Operation Ernest Will, to the audience out there, basically that's the code name for escorting the Kuwaiti tankers up through the
Yep.
Gulf in '87, '88. That's an interesting analogy because the Navy was far bigger than
Yeah.
it is now. I think it was
True.
close to 600 ships. Now it's 335, whatever.
Yeah.
And of course, it did indeed bring in NATO task forces. It brought in the
Yeah.
French, it brought in the British.
Yeah.
Um, the Charles de Gaulle was there, etc. And so that gets into the question of, what's your assessment of the military feasibility of launching operations? My personal opinion is that it's obvious by the deployment of ground forces in this situation that they got caught. I'm talking about Trump with their pants down because they sent in a BLT from the Pacific, a BLT from
Mm.
California. They put the
Mhm.
Ready Brigade 82nd on alert. And,
Correct.
you have essentially, at the most, an ersatz division of conventional troops. And then, of course, you have the whole JSOC apparatus there, which we saw used most likely in the rescue of this pilot who was just downed. But
Agreed.
that is not enough strength to go in there and engage in, even if you do island hopping, like, I mean, I'm just
Mhm.
thinking about how they're actually going to attack these different islands to seize them, and then who's going to garrison them, and what's going to be the sustainment of that. And I'm just wondering, and you're talking with your students, the
Yeah.
whole issue of cargo islands. So what are you sort of getting out from looking analytically at this from a
Mhm.
military point of view?
Yeah. Okay. So let me make a couple points. So I think one of the most important things that is the importance of alliances, and this is where I really diverge from Trump on this. Like so when the Soviet Union collapsed,
Yep.
we all wanted to reduce our defense spending, and so we essentially it's an unwritten agreement, but we had agreement with NATO countries and with Japan and South Korea that we're going to focus on the aircraft carriers and the submarines, power projection. You all focus on the minesweepers and mine hunters because you're in congested water. So the Europeans are really good. They're better, honestly, than we are at mine sweeping and mine hunting because they have to do the Baltic, they have to do the Adriatic and the Aegean and the Mediterranean. And Japan is the Sea of Japan and the East China Sea. And same for the South Koreans are always worried about mines from North Korea. We don't really, I mean, nobody's mining Los Angeles. Like it's not like how would you get we'd see them coming, right? So there's a reason why we decided to have this division of duties, but you can't be attacking allies with rhetoric and all these antics for 14 months and then say, come help us, help you. It just, that doesn't work, right? And so, in the end, I think they will do it. My old boss at the Fletcher School, Admiral Stavridis, who was Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, he keeps saying what I've been saying too to my European friends, like, you might as well go start in the Red Sea because you'll benefit from securing the Strait of Hormuz as well. But just don't, it's not going to be with the US. And I do think we're seeing this emerge with the UK, and other Europeans, and I think Japan will join that coalition. So there'll be a maritime coalition that helps with the minesweeping, like we saw in the tanker war, as you mentioned in 87, 88. But who's going to be missing in action there is the United States, because of how Trump has treated our allies. It is too toxic domestically for those European allies to collaborate so directly with the United States, which I think is a huge loss for us, frankly. And so that's one piece of it. The other piece is because of what we've seen in the Black Sea and the Red Sea, which really, and I think the Black Sea is the one to focus on, all the Ukrainian innovation with both surface drones and subsurface drones. I think in many ways it's a revolution in mine warfare, where they're now smart and mobile and using and you can add AI to it, where they just look for a big magnetic change in the water, which would be a ship, and just go for it. They don't need a crew. So I think that in congested waterways, this could be a huge problem that I think has no easy answers. I think that the U.S. military is doing their best to come up with a viable solution that won't be massive casualties. If here's kind of if we're going to have to do it, I think we'd be in collaboration with our allies, both the regional allies, so the Saudis and the UAE, and then European navies would be helping as well. What I think are the most critical items that we've brought into the region are those A-10 Warthogs, which were very effective in the Gulf War I against tanks. They'd be very effective against small boats in the Strait. They're very strong aircraft. I mean, they're some of my favorite aircrafts. Honestly, they're aircraft that were clearly designed by engineers.
American Stukas,
Yeah.
Stukas.
Yeah, they really are. I mean, and they'll be very effective, but again, they're not like a silver bullet, right? And so they're not going to be able to see everything. An undersea drone is going to be hard for them to pick up, but they can help with the small boat surface attack, which will be very helpful. I do think that we're able to use the Ukrainian anti-drone technology. I think actually it's something I noted last weekend was Zelensky went and signed 10-year agreements with Saudi Arabia, UAE, and I think there was one more, maybe it was Bahrain or Qatar, for anti-drone technology. What I tell my students is necessity is the mother of innovation, right? Ukrainians have had to innovate on drone warfare. They're really the world leaders in many ways. And they are bringing that technology into the Gulf. And the Gulf countries can afford to pay the sort of consulting fee there. And what's interesting is, in some ways, Ukraine has sort of joined this fight because Iran has been on Russia's side in the Ukraine-Russia war, right? And so, in some ways, it's like payback, right?
Yeah.
And so, but that doesn't mean any of it's going to be easy. So I would say, sort of my key takeaway is that it's going to be really hard. It's really hard to do without casualties. I think it's probably impossible, actually. There'll be some casualties, but maybe they would be minimal. And then the question really becomes, if you can create essentially a layered defense with the A-10s, with some kind of sophisticated, because we have undersea drones as well, so some sort of counter mine measures, we can probably greatly reduce the risk of shipping going through at least the Omani side, which fortunately is a deeper side of the Strait of Hormuz. So I think it can be done, but it's not without risk.
All right. And so the issue there, of course, is that if we are engaging in, we have enough force there to do raids with the conventional forces there, JSOC there, et cetera. But the question is that then you got a prolonged conflict going on. And to me, what I think is a determinant in the background is sort of things we've been talking about in the beginning. That is the global economic situation. Where does this start to come as a crunch on Trump? Is he going to, because some of the comments he makes, you sort of think like, well, they're doing this transactional foreign policy that he's so infamous for, where he's going to get a little bit of the action for his family and his minions, like he's done with his son-in-law, or how he did when he overthrew Maduro, et cetera. And again, using U.S. Armed Forces basically for, personal gain is quite an amazing concept to me. Uh, but um, but how do you just before get in other people coming in with their comments that
Sure.
how do you see this resolving itself? I mean, yeah, sure he could declare victory, but on the other hand, there's the hubris factor. There's the fact that again, he's not completely out of his mind. I mean, he sort of is playing the mad Nixon kind of Haldeman
Yeah.
stereotype that we got from Watergate.
True.
But nevertheless, he has that crunch coming on him of global economic problems, which he doesn't want to be responsible for, even though he'll say, "Oh, I didn't cause it; they caused it." And
Yeah.
that to me, I think, is a big constraint on him. But I could be wrong. But what's your assessment?
So I think it's a constraint. I think we're going to see a lot happen in the next couple weeks. But I'm going to stand by a prediction I made last month, which I'd be
Ah,
surprised I'd be surprised if we had major combat operations continuing by the end of April. I'd be very surprised because I think the economy can't take it. And as soon as that becomes critically apparent and he knows he's going to take the blame, he's going to take the blame even though he may deny it. It's not rocket science to the average person. Before this war, gasoline prices were here. After the war, they're here. I mean, he's going to pay a price for that, and I think he knows that. So I think you're going to see a concerted effort this week to change the momentum, either with a deal, which I think is kind of unlikely. I think the Iranians don't want to give him that option, right? Or they're going to hit really hard, declare victory, and go home. What might happen on the islands? This is another point that I think is important. So when the UAE became independent from Britain, so in 1971, it had control over three islands: Abu
yeah,
Musa
Abu
and the
Musa,
Greater
right? The
Cumberland. And
tombs,
these
yeah,
are very important for securing the Strait of Hormuz. And they're disputed.
ah,
And the UAE is, I think, eager to capture them. Abu
yeah,
Musa is actually much closer to the UAE than it is to Iran. So I could see those islands
right,
with Marines assisting being essentially secured by the UAE and garrisoned
right,
by the UAE,
right,
actually.
right. Good point. Good
So I
point.
could see those happening. I think we can always threaten Karg Island. I think that seizing. I mean, I could see Trump declaring victory and then having the US military, which has really been saving him right and left, by the way, like because the US military is effective. I think the problem's really the leadership at the top doesn't have a good
Right.
vision of what to do here. But tactically we're winning right and left. And they're not wrong to say, I mean, the conventional Navy has been degraded, the Air Force is gone. Like Iran is less powerful today, obviously, than it was, on February 27th
Right.
from a conventional military perspective. But it doesn't mean they can't cause all kinds of trouble with asymmetric warfare. And they have geography on there, very mountainous country. I don't see any scenario where we do a major invasion of Iran. I just don't see
Right.
it.
Right.
I could see us garrisoning some Marines just right by Karg Island, essentially as a threat. I could see us also enabling the UAE to take Abu Musa and Greater Tum and Lesser Tum. I could see us keeping squadrons of A-10s in both Oman and the UAE to help secure the Strait of Hormuz. I could also see the Europeans coming once we've essentially stopped the major combat operations coming in to secure their own ships. And maybe because they stayed out of it, the Iranians just say, if it's a French escorted, French flagged ship, we're not going to attack it. Same for all the Europeans and the Japanese. So in the end, we may see this sort of like uncomfortable path forward where everyone's looking out for their own ships, flagging their tankers. The Europeans essentially escort Europeans. They probably work with the Japanese. Maybe even the Chinese show up to secure theirs. India's already sent a large navy, but what we end up seeing is that the U.S. Navy sort of pulls back, is kind of sitting where it is now, kind of out in the Indian Ocean. We don't really have any naval assets inside the Gulf right now. And those Gulf Cooperation Council countries are going to have to increase their military spending to help secure their own areas. And I could see them investing a lot in the Ukrainian technology, the U.S. and Israeli kind of air defense technology. So kind of going back to your point, who may be the great beneficiaries are the Raytheons of the world, who all of a sudden don't just sell the United States, but sell a lot more to these Gulf Cooperation Council countries who can afford it. And I do think what Iran did in the early days of this war greatly diminished the trust level between them and the Gulf Cooperation Council countries. Even Oman and Qatar, who were they had pretty good working relationships with the Iranians, they're not so impressed with Iran, like taking out some of their port facilities in Oman and then the Ras Laffan LNG, terminal being hit. I mean, that was aggressive on the Iranian side. So I think they'll pay a price for that. But there's no question the U.S. pays a price for this. Trump will pay a reputational price for this, I think, in almost any scenario.
Yeah, well, also the United States will, but
Of course, yeah.
again, before I bring everybody in, the issue of the nuclear issue, because
Oh, sure. Yeah.
what kills me is we've been, again, we don't know what the planning process is. We don't know that in any detail. I just saw that Trump had the Office of Legal Counsel issue a memo attacking the Presidential Records Act, which essentially says I can take the records of my administration, destroy them if I want. They're quite amazing. So it's going to be fascinating to try to reconstruct this as years go on. But let's just see some of the leaks we've been dealing with. So first of all, the idea that they could overthrow a government with their campaign, which I guess was sold on by whoever, we don't know who. I mean, I don't know. The issue of Netanyahu is an interesting question.
Yeah.
Different people, we don't know what they actually did, but we know that the interoperability of both the U.S. Air Force, the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Marine Corps air components, and the IAF is pretty good. Central Command has been interoperable with
really
them
good
for a while.
Yeah.
And we have the two best air forces in the world basically doing this.
That's true.
And so I could be wrong. There could be a situation, but they obviously felt with their calculations that they could do what Colonel Worden would argue back in the Gulf War in 1991, that an air campaign would succeed, even though historically you know that the evidence is totally contrary to that.
Right.
So they, of course, regime change is something they've been arguing about. I mean, now Trump has gone back and forth. I know the first day he actually announced regime change.
He did.
Flip-flop back and forth. And now he said, well, we decapitated him a couple of times. That's regime change. And again, I'm not defending the government there. I'm well aware of the government
Don't worry.
there.
Yeah.
But whether that's an outcome or not is unlikely. And usually nationally will reinforce itself. And then we have the question of the nuclear weapons development. Now, that is one thing. Now, what's your assessment of that? Because it's clear to me that, people are talking about, well, they're going to launch a big, operation they're going to seize control of where these, who knows where the stuff is my question. But what do you make of all that? Because that rationale, we go back and forth. They announced after the June War, they destroyed it all. And that turned out to be, well, that doesn't seem to be the rationale they argued a few weeks ago when they started all this. So what's your assessment of all that?
Yeah, so I'm going to actually quote my old boss, Admiral Stavridis, because he would just know more about
this. Well,
than
that's true. Admiral Stavridis would be interesting.
He knows things, right?
You should ask him. I'd love to talk to Admiral.
Yeah, well, he got asked this very question, and he said, getting that highly enriched uranium out is not mission impossible, but it's pretty close. It's mission very, very hard. And what you'd have to do is you'd have to essentially establish like a
perimeter.
A perimeter.
Yeah.
And an airstrip.
Right.
And then you'd have to fly in. So you'd have to fly in a lot of special forces, create a perimeter. They would be there for months, which is a risk. What? I mean, a huge risk. And so, I think people, my hunch is we have a sense of how deep these things are buried. I think that we probably can. I don't see us doing that in this round. I think if that happens, it will be in the next round of conflict if there's, say, a ceasefire. And I think we would monitor very closely with satellites, kind of, are they trying to dig up? Because you'd have to dig up these things. Plus, it weighs 1,000 pounds. Going to be in, that's just the uranium. Plus, it's encased in cement. You need, I mean, this is really hard to do in any scenario. So I think the, mission very, very hard is the right way to do it, is the right way to think about it. But in theory, it could be done by the U.S. military, but we'd take casualties, no question. It would be super unpopular. And it's unclear to me that it is something that needs to happen in the short term. I think it probably needs to happen in the medium term, but you could theoretically come to some kind of terms there. And I do think that there's a possible deal to be made with whatever new regime kind of emerges in Iran. I feel it's still very unclear kind of who's in charge there. But
Right.
once it's clear who's in charge, for a kind of, there could be a carrot and stick approach where it's some sanction relief, maybe some rebuilding help, only in the sense of like sanction relief. I don't think we're
Right.
paying anything. I think that's too, I don't think it could happen politically. But then also, if the carrot doesn't work, that's where I think, so I think Carg Island comes in that scenario where we say, we're going to cut you off economically by essentially preventing your oil exports, which would be very, but that's playing real hardball. And again, it's not
But
without
then, but then
risk.
you're going right up against China.
Yeah.
That's the
Yeah.
interesting thing about all this.
Yeah, well, that's correct, and so, and plus, depending on what happens in the Strait of Hormuz, presumably the Iranians are going to be able to, say there's a ceasefire and it starts flowing again, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, they sort of rebuild their infrastructure, things sort of get back to normal, oil prices go down, but that threat to the Strait of Hormuz, I think, can be reconstituted pretty quickly by the Iranians,
Oh,
right? So,
absolutely.
so if, in this sort of negotiation, I think it has to be kind of a grand bargain. I think you probably want to bring the Chinese in on that and the Russians, which again is not easy. But I do think that I think it's possible, right? And it's probably worth trying diplomatically where you could, if you have the right leadership in Iran, that, because the population in Iran, I think, really is sort of sick of the sanctions. They're kind of sick of the Ayatollahs
Well,
too,
yeah. No, well,
right?
look what
And
happened.
so,
Look what
I
happened in
think,
December. Look what happened in December and early
yeah.
January.
Oh, absolutely.
When they
Absolutely.
revolted. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it'll be interesting too. I mean, somebody to keep your eye on is the current president of Iran, who's really Armenian, right? And or Azerbaijani
Right.
background, has sort of Armenian last name. He's known as a reformer. He was kind of, in January saying, we should kind of loosen up and try to, like ease up on the population a little bit. So you might have, he might emerge as a leader that you could do a deal with. But I think it's really too early to tell. This stuff is so hard to predict at this stage. As I've said a couple times, I feel we're in the fog of war still.
No,
and I
of
think the
course.
next 2 weeks are going to be that way. And I think we won't have an answer to the uranium question until the medium term, whatever that is, right? So, it really depends on kind of where things land. But there could be a diplomatic solution to that depending on who ends up being in charge in
All right.
Tehran.
Now I will hold you to the
Yeah.
predictions down the road.
Okay, fair enough.
Because I try not to do that. I mean, we have some people who love to predict, and
Yeah,
it's
I'm
like you always get
hesitant, but
stuck
I'll
in the
stick
mud
by it.
there.
I already am on record, so I'll stick by
Right,
it.
right.
Fingers
Okay, go
crossed.
on, Alex. Go on, Alex. You
Yeah.
just have to unmute.
Yeah. First, let me ask, do you prefer Professor Weitz, Rockford, or what?
Whatever. Don't worry about it. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
We're at the
Well,
Rockford stage right now.
Yeah. Do it. Whatever makes it easy.
Your idea about, which again has been discussed of, saying Abu Musa and the Tomb Islands.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the biggest one is 20 square kilometers. The other,
Right.
I think the Tomb
Abu
one
Musa.
is 10 square kilometers. One is only 2 square kilometers.
Correct.
Two of them have airfields on them, but they're, I've seen, photos, maps of them, they're all pretty flat, open. So, I mean, they're kind of, if you have troops on there, there's like almost no cover. You would be, I mean, there's how are you going to dig in? I mean, what you're going to be sitting ducks again. the Iranians can do everything from, hit them with hundreds of drones, FPV drones, to again using those cluster missiles they have to just
Yeah.
kind of carpet bomb the island essentially. And plus the UAE, from what I remember, again, their military involvement in the war in Yemen against Ansar Allah, they
Right.
basically mostly used mercenaries.
True.
So
True.
who are they if the
Yeah.
UAE is gonna, retain it and they're gonna occupy it, not us, and get killed? I mean, I just don't see. But and I've also seen proposed, yeah, taking Keshem Island. You've kind of also
Ooh,
discussed
Well,
that,
Karg,
I mean,
that's a bigger island.
it's like
but also landing in
150,000 people. Yeah.
Baluchistan to
Yeah.
link up
Yeah.
with the Baluchi separatists there.
Sure.
Though again, I don't know how that reopens the straits, but that's been so. I just wonder what you think. But also in general, kind of like all of them as like viable
Yeah.
eh, um, amphibious operations, or
Sure.
I guess like landing them on ospreys as
Well,
a way to
so yeah,
control.
let me sort of we'll go through here. So I think like Larak Island and Kesem Island. Kesem Island has about 150,000 people. They're right off the coast of Iran. I think they're in theory you could take them, but you'd be defending all the time, and it wouldn't be pretty. Um, I think the three that would be the easiest to take would be those Abu Musa and the two Tums, the greater and lesser. They're small for the same reasons that you mentioned, them being hard to hold, will be hard for the Iranians to hold. So it may end up being that we just strafe them a lot, maybe take nominal possession of them, and almost demilitarize them. And then you defend them against an amphibious retake by Iran. So that may end up being where kind of they become no man's islands in a way, where we go in, clear them with the UAE, the UAE takes control, and then essentially it becomes like if the Iranians are trying to take them by amphibious assault, you just take out their boats or you take out their aircraft flying in there, and you could automate some of that. Or you could have a very small force that would be dug in and maybe rotated out fairly frequently, kind of at night or things like that. There's a way to do it where you minimize the risk of life, but you also, because what the Iranians do with those is they're right at the sort of approach to the Strait of Hormuz coming from the Gulf. So they're essentially early warning islands of who's going through there, early detection islands. So there's a reason to take them to open the Strait of Hormuz because you put the Iranians a little bit more on the defensive, and then you could also put in there some jamming capabilities. Again, you'd have to harden them, but you could kind of electronically jam some of the detection that the Iranians use to detect ships. So there's a reason why those three, I think, are on the short list to really think about. And I'm sure they've all been attacked. I haven't been able to confirm that. I've tried, but I haven't been able to find the right open source information on it. But my sense is that those islands have been attacked. The sensors that are there are probably degraded. The garrisons that are there are probably degraded. And because, especially Abu Musa is actually closer to the UAE than it is Iran, I think it's probably pretty low on the resupply list right now in Iran. I think they're in sort of an existential crisis, territorial defense kind of situation. So, I would see that, but I think you're right about those islands that are closer. I think it would be crazy to try to take Kesem Island. I mean, I think that would
Oh, that's
be.
ridiculous.
I
No,
mean, I just don't see it. And I even in Larak, which is right there, I just
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
see it either. I don't think you get strategic benefit. They're so close to the
right.
Iranian coastline that you take them and so what? Whereas I do think
But
Abu Musa and the two Tums, like it's worth at least taking them sort of out of the fight, whether they're just sort of
right,
heavily degraded but not occupied. That would
yeah.
probably be better than the status quo. So yeah, I hope that helps.
And does that do anything to open the straits
It
more, or
helps.
it's
So,
just
so
it does?
Abu, doing something on the status quo with Abu Musa and the two Tums, it does help because
Uh-huh.
then the approach in the commercial shipping that would be going through, say it's with an escort and it's kind of hugging the Omani coastline, it would just be they'd be detected later and therefore be sort of there'd be less opportunity for the Iranians to try to launch whether it's drones or mines or missiles. They'd have less intelligence on the shipping, which is why I think those are the ones that I've sort of put at the top of my list. If we're going to do anything with these Marine Expeditionary Units, I could see doing an assist to the UAE. The other thing that I think is important because, if the goal is to destabilize this regime so much, even if there's not regime change now, but to sort of position that regime to be facing, unrest and maybe, popular unrest, that what you're trying to do is not attack the Iranian people. So the fact that they're disputed islands, they were seized by the Shah in 71. These aren't sort of like long-standing Persian Empire possessions that there's a storied history. What I've heard, one of my students who's from Oman actually was mentioning to me that most of the people who live on Abu Musa are actually like Emiratis, right? So they're like the population that's there is actually being occupied by Iran, but they're actually would identify as Emiratis. So I think that what you need to do if you are trying to encourage that regime change is you have to not attack the civilian population to the extent possible, which is one reason I think, Trump's like tweets this morning about his power plant day on Tuesday. I think that's totally counterproductive to the sort of like strategic goals that at least were outlined at first.
You got a follow up, Alex?
No, just it's somebody pointed out again that I guess in the 17th century and in the 16th century, the Portuguese actually, built a fort and occupied the straits.
That's
But
true.
I think
They
yeah, in
did.
the early 17th century,
Yeah.
with British help, actually, the the Persians,
Took them
back I
back.
think it's I forget which dynasty it
They have
was
a
back
fort. They
then,
have a
but yeah,
fort.
they basically besieged the fort, and actually with Royal Navy help, they forced its surrender. So, like for the 17th century, I think up until obviously the British came in and kind of started running the Gulf. But yeah, back then, essentially the Persian Empire controlled the Straits for about a century, and yeah, I think collected some kind of toll
Well,
for
Hormuz Island is actually a tourist trap. I mean, that's where that
That's
fort
right.
is, and they
Yeah.
have interesting things. They have a valley of coral reef that they call the Rainbow Valley. It's very interesting. I was looking at tourist data on these different islands.
Yeah. No,
And
Hormuz would be the other fun Portuguese island that's a tourist destination is Socotra, which is off the
uh,
coast of Somalia, but it's under Yemeni control, also was a Portuguese base. I do want to give you a warning. I'm going to have to go relatively soon, so I could take a question or two, but then I have to sign off, unfortunately.
Very good, very good. Anybody else have a question that they'd like to ask?
yeah, Julian
Julian or
or
John
Tom.
or Tom? Tom, you want to ask a question?
Frank's out there. I'm surprised Frank hasn't raised his
Well,
hand.
the only question I have is kind of a general question is, where do some of these people think all these troops are going to come from? You know,
Yeah.
we don't have a lot of troops like
Yeah,
we
it's
used
true.
to have, and they're drafted, they don't have to come in the military. So where do we think a lot of these guys are going to come from?
Let me ask John ask a question too. Go on, John. You wanted to ask a question, John?
Yeah, pardon my coming in late and sounding totally clueless, but
We're all
most
clueless,
definitely-
man. Go on.
Yeah, I know, and that's why I would never get involved in these misadventures because I don't know enough, like even to be. I know I'm stupid enough not to know enough to go and do any of this shit, but. Does anyone think that a ground invasion by the United States is likely? And if so, where would that be? I mean, you may have already talked about this.
Well, we can summarize that. Go on, Frank. Throw your comment in, Frank, and then we'll wrap up with Rockford here. Go on, Frank.
Well, actually, mine was a little bit more. Okay, I have a problem with serendipity and happenstance, and when it comes to history, it does seem strange that the Ukrainian strategy against Russia, against its refineries, was actually having serious effect when it was $65 a barrel, and This has turned that around on its head. In fact, Zelensky's been requested not to hit particularly the Primorsk ones around St. Petersburg, because it is increasing the price of oil. And Russia's economy was on the ropes. It absolutely was, and now it's got a fillip. It's got it's been obviously when oil goes to whatever, could go to as much as 150. It can't help but do well and be able to sustain its economy. This is strange, and it's supporting Iran, and also Iran is in fact probably trebled its income, its revenue from its oil, since it's not obviously preventing its own ships going through, and that oil is doing well. And then of course you've got the shadow fleet out there that it's not really tied to insurance. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of benefit there, and I'm not sure why we seem to think that this is just purely an American operation. Yeah. It seems almost like the script was written by somebody else.
All right. Well, let me.
I got three questions.
All right, these are great. So let me tackle. So the sort of recruitment challenges is a real issue, and the land invasion. Let me tackle those first, and then I'll go to the last question. And so so I don't see any large scale ground invasion. I just don't see it. I think the most we would do is maybe take Karg Island, where you would take some incoming, because it's close enough that it could be within artillery range, though that's very risky because they wouldn't want to hit the oil facilities. It's unclear to me you even need to occupy it to cause real problems. You could also, in theory, if you wanted to play hardball with sort of the tankers, you could blockade and seize the tankers as they even came out of the Strait of Hormuz, seize the Iranian oil tankers like we've been seizing the Venezuelan oil tankers. So there are other scenarios, but I do think that so if there were kind of large scale operations in country, I think it'd be deeply unpopular, and I think you would have a recruitment problem. So I think I don't see Trump is so sort of against that. I'm actually kind of glad about that. Actually, I don't think we're going to be going on a major land war misadventure in Iran, because I don't think it would end well. And I think he doesn't think it would end well, so I think he won't do it. But one thing this is taxing a lot is our Navy. So our Navy, our Navy carriers aren't used to being out this long. We do have a substantially smaller Navy than we did in the 80s. This is really taxing that fleet, taxing the crew, and those naval aviators as well. So yeah, and the Air Force is being taxed as well. I mean, we have the largest Air Force by far. But it comes with a price. The airplanes themselves are being taxed by it, but then also the pilots. So it's this is not a cost-free exercise. And then on the last point, I think it's a really good point to make, that by injecting this much geopolitical uncertainty into the oil markets, all oil producers are making more money, including Russia and Iran, right? So if your goal was to try to really squeeze Russia economically, this is the opposite of helpful on that goal. If you wanted to squeeze Iran economically as well, because we're letting those tankers out because we want to try to keep oil prices down, they're making a lot more money per barrel. So their oil revenues have gone up for both of those countries. So, I think that, those are supposedly short term, right? But we'll see. I mean, this is, it's going to take a while for the supply disruptions for this long. If it's 35 days plus you add another 2 weeks to that, even if in 2 weeks or by the end of April we start to see sort of normal flows through the Strait of Hormuz, still going to take a long time to work through the system, and so during that whole time, oil prices will be elevated, which means more revenue to Russia, more revenue to Iran, and any other oil producers.
Well, I want to thank you, Rockford. Thank you so much. We're definitely going to hold you to come back again down the road.
I'd love to. This was great.
And it was really fun to listen to you. And trust me, we could have kept you on for another hour. So,
Well, yeah. If I didn't have to teach tomorrow, I would do it. I have
no,
two
yeah.
classes tomorrow morning. So,
Oh, okay.
hey,
Don't
this
worry
was a
about it.
real pleasure, Jim. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much,
Yeah,
Rob.
really
Thank you for your
appreciate it.
time.
And anytime, let me know if you'd like to do it
Will.
again. And
Sure, we will.
if there's a link to it, let me know, and
I will. I
we'll
will send you the
circulate
link,
it.
and we'll.
That'll be great.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank
All
you.
right. So
Bye-bye.
long.
Who went to the
Cheers.